When did someone's apology make everything worse? The morning I received Dr. Bennett's voicemail apology, I was sitting in my Subaru outside the unemployment office, trying to work up the courage to go inside. His voice was shaky, almost whispering, and he kept saying how sorry he was about the unfortunate misunderstanding with my medical records. He mentioned something about contacting my lawyer, which confused me because I didn't have a lawyer. I played the message 3 more times before the dread settled in my stomach like a stone. I'd been Dr. Bennett's patient for 2 years, seeing him monthly for anxiety medication that actually worked. Nothing dramatic, just standard Lexapro that kept me functional enough to hold down my job at the insurance claims office. The last appointment had been routine. He'd refilled my prescription, we'd talked about adjusting the dosage, and I'd scheduled my next visit. That was 6 weeks ago, and everything had been normal until yesterday when my boss called me into her office with a manila folder and a look I'd never seen before. The folder contained a letter from Dr. Bennett's practice administrator, dated 3 weeks earlier, explaining that they were required to notify my employer about a significant change in my psychiatric treatment status. The letter stated that I had been diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features and was currently experiencing a manic episode that made me potentially dangerous to myself and others in a workplace environment. It recommended immediate suspension pending psychiatric evaluation. My boss, Janet, had read the letter word for word while I sat there feeling the room spin around me. She kept apologizing as she explained that company policy required immediate administrative leave for any employee deemed a safety risk by a medical professional. Human Resources had already been notified, and my access card was being deactivated. She handed me a packet of forms for applying for short-term disability benefits and said they'd hold my job for up to 6 months if I got proper treatment. I tried explaining that none of it was true, that I'd never been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, that I was taking anxiety medication and functioning perfectly fine. But Janet just kept pointing to the letterhead and Dr. Bennett's signature, saying the company had to take medical professionals seriously. She walked me to my desk while I packed my personal items into a cardboard box, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my coffee mug. The drive home had been a blur of panic and confusion. I'd tried calling Dr. Bennett's office immediately, but got transferred between 3 different people before being told the doctor was unavailable and someone would call me back. That callback never came, which is why his voicemail apology the next morning felt like a punch to the gut instead of relief. I finally forced myself out of the car and into the unemployment office, clutching the disability forms Janet had given me. The waiting room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and desperation, with dozens of people filling out paperwork on clipboards. I took a number and sat down to read through the forms more carefully, discovering that applying for disability benefits would require extensive medical documentation proving my supposed psychiatric condition. The woman at the counter, Miss Morales, according to her nameplate, reviewed my paperwork with practiced efficiency. She explained that my employer had already filed the initial notification, confirming I was on medical leave for a psychiatric emergency. The system showed I was eligible for benefits, but the approval process could take 8 to 12 weeks. In the meantime, I'd need to provide updated medical records, treatment plans, and psychiatric evaluations to maintain my claim status. When I explained that the diagnosis was wrong, that there had been some kind of mistake, Miss Morales just shrugged and said I'd need to take that up with my doctor. The unemployment system could only process what the medical records showed, and according to their database, I was currently being treated for severe mental illness that prevented me from working. She handed me a list of approved psychiatric evaluators and said getting a second opinion might help my case. I spent the rest of the morning calling Dr. Bennett's office every 30 minutes, finally reaching his nurse practitioner around noon. Sarah had been handling my refills for months and knew my actual medical history, but when I explained what happened, she went completely silent for almost a minute. Then she said she needed to check my file and would call me back, her voice suddenly formal and distant. That afternoon, I drove to the medical office building where Dr. Bennett practiced, hoping to resolve everything in person. The receptionist recognized me but wouldn't let me pass the waiting room without an appointment. She kept checking her computer screen and making hushed phone calls while I sat there for 2 hours, watching other patients come and go normally. Finally, the practice administrator came out to speak with me. Margaret was a woman in her 50s who handled all the insurance and legal issues for the practice. She led me into a small conference room and closed the door before pulling out a thick file with my name on it. She opened it carefully, like she was handling evidence, and showed me medical notes I'd never seen before. The entries were dated from my last several appointments, but they described a completely different person. According to the notes, I'd been exhibiting increasing signs of mania, talking rapidly about conspiracy theories, making threats against coworkers, and showing signs of paranoid delusions. One entry described me as agitated and potentially violent during a session where I supposedly threw a chair across the room. I stared at the pages in complete shock, recognizing Dr. Bennett's handwriting but none of the content. I'd never thrown furniture or made threats or talked about conspiracies. My appointments had been routine medication checks where we discussed dosage adjustments and side effects. I tried explaining this to Margaret, but she just kept pointing to the documented pattern of escalating symptoms. She explained that Dr. Bennett had been concerned about my deteriorating condition for weeks but hadn't wanted to alarm me by discussing the severity, my symptoms. When I'd missed my last appointment, he'd decided to notify my employer as a safety precaution. The letter to my company had been sent as part of his duty to protect both me and the people around me from potential harm. The missed appointment she mentioned was news to me. I'd never scheduled a follow-up after my last visit 6 weeks ago because Dr. Bennett had said we'd reassess in 3 months. But Margaret showed me documentation indicating I was supposed to come in for emergency monitoring after exhibiting severe manic symptoms. When I failed to show up, they'd assumed my condition was worsening and had taken protective action. I asked to speak with Dr. Bennett directly, but Margaret said he was at a medical conference for the rest of the week. She suggested I schedule an appointment for the following Monday so we could discuss adjusting my treatment plan. In the meantime, she recommended I start taking mood stabilizers immediately and consider voluntary psychiatric hospitalization if I felt like I might become dangerous. Walking out of that office, I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. My car keys felt foreign in my hands, and I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to process what had happened. Someone had systematically documented a version of me that didn't exist, creating a medical record that painted me as severely mentally ill and potentially violent. That evening, I called my brother David in Portland and tried to explain the situation. He listened patiently while I went through everything, but I could hear the concern growing in his voice. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time before asking if I'd been feeling more anxious lately or having trouble sleeping. He suggested that maybe I wasn't aware of how my behavior had been changing and should trust Dr. Bennett's professional judgment. The doubt in my own brother's voice made everything worse. I hung up and spent the night researching medical malpractice lawyers, but every website emphasized that proving false documentation was extremely difficult and expensive. Most attorneys wouldn't take psychiatric cases unless there was clear evidence of deliberate fraud, and even then, the legal process could take years. Friday morning brought another voicemail from Dr. Bennett, this one longer and more detailed. He explained that he'd reviewed my case with colleagues at the conference and realized there might have been some documentation errors in my file. He wanted to meet as soon as possible to discuss correcting the record and restoring my employment status. His tone was apologetic but urgent, mentioning something about potential liability issues that needed immediate attention. I called back immediately and reached him directly for the first time since this started. Dr. Bennett sounded genuinely distressed, admitting that there had been a serious mix-up with patient files. He explained that his new electronic medical record system had somehow merged my information with another patient who actually did have severe bipolar disorder. The threatening behavior and missed appointments had been documented for someone else entirely. He promised to send correction letters to my employer and the unemployment office immediately, explaining that the original diagnosis and safety concerns were completely unfounded. He also offered to provide documentation for any legal claims I might want to pursue against the medical record software company. His relief was palpable as he apologized repeatedly and assured me this would be resolved within days. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger as Dr. Bennett explained the technical details of the mix-up. Apparently, 2 patients with similar names had been assigned sequential ID numbers in the new system, and some kind of database error had cross-contaminated our files. The other patient's severe psychiatric episodes had been attributed to me, while my routine anxiety treatment had been documented under her name. The correction process turned out to be far more complicated than Dr. Bennett had promised. When I called Janet on Monday morning to explain the mix-up, she said she'd need official documentation from the medical practice before they could consider reinstating me. The original letter had created a paper trail through HR, corporate risk management, and the insurance company that couldn't be undone with a simple phone call. Dr. Bennett's correction letter arrived at my office on Tuesday, but it raised more questions than it answered. Instead of clearly stating that the original diagnosis was completely wrong, the letter used vague language about clarifying certain aspects of the patient's treatment history and updating previous clinical impressions based on additional information. It recommended that I undergo a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation before returning to work, essentially validating my employer's concerns about my mental health. Janet called me Wednesday morning to explain that the correction letter wasn't sufficient for HR to lift the administrative suspension. The original documentation had been filed with the State Disability Board and the company's insurance carrier, creating regulatory requirements that couldn't be reversed without extensive medical review. She suggested I hire an attorney to help navigate the bureaucratic process, estimating it could take months to fully clear my employment record. The unemployment office was equally unhelpful when I brought them the correction letter. Ms. Morales explained that changing a medical determination required formal appeals through the Disability Board, which had its own timeline and documentation requirements. In the meantime, my benefits application was still being processed based on the original psychiatric diagnosis, and any changes would need to go through a separate administrative procedure. I spent Thursday morning at the county courthouse filing a formal complaint against Dr. Bennett's practice with the state medical board. The clerk explained that investigating medical record errors could take up to a year, and even then, the board typically focused on disciplinary action rather than correcting past documentation. She recommended I also file complaints with the electronic medical record company and consider pursuing civil litigation for the damages to my employment and reputation. My brother David flew out that weekend to help me navigate the legal system, finally understanding the severity of the situation after seeing the conflicting medical records. We met with 3 different attorneys, learning that medical malpractice cases involving administrative errors were particularly difficult to prosecute. Most lawyers wanted retainers of $20,000 or more, with no guarantee of success. The attorney we finally hired, Sandra Way, specialized in employment discrimination and medical privacy violations. She explained that while the original error might have been accidental, Dr. Bennett's inadequate correction letter could constitute professional negligence. Her strategy was to pursue multiple claims simultaneously, targeting the medical practice, the software company, and potentially my employer for wrongful termination. Sandra's first step was requesting complete copies of both my medical record and the other patient's file to document the extent of the mix-up. Dr. Bennett's practice initially resisted, claiming patient privacy concerns, but complied after receiving a formal legal demand. The records revealed that the cross-contamination was even worse than originally described, with medical histories, prescription records, and billing information completely scrambled between multiple patients. It turned out I wasn't the only person affected by the database error. Sandra discovered that at least 6 other patients had experienced similar file mix-ups, with diagnoses and treatments assigned to the wrong people. One elderly man had been prescribed psychiatric medication for depression he didn't have, while a woman with severe bipolar disorder had been told her condition was just anxiety and given inadequate treatment. The scope of the medical record catastrophe became clear as we gathered evidence from other affected patients. The practice had implemented the new electronic system 6 months earlier, and the database corruption had been gradually worsening without anyone noticing. Critical medical information had been systematically misassigned, creating false treatment histories and potentially dangerous prescription errors. Dr. Bennett finally agreed to meet with Sandra and me in early November, 3 months after the original incident. He looked exhausted as he explained how the software company had assured him the system migration was foolproof. The practice had been paying thousands of dollars monthly for technical support that apparently consisted of automated responses and scripted troubleshooting procedures. During the meeting, Dr. Bennett revealed that he discovered the database problems weeks before sending the letter to my employer, but hadn't understood the full extent of the file contamination. He'd seen concerning notes in my record that didn't match his memory of our sessions, but assumed he'd forgotten details or failed to document symptoms properly. The decision to notify my workplace had been based on medical notes he'd trusted but hadn't actually written. His explanation made everything worse rather than better. Instead of an innocent technical error, the situation now appeared to involve professional negligence and poor patient care standards. Dr. Bennett had made critical decisions about my mental health and employment based on medical records he hadn't bothered to verify or question. Despite knowing the computer system was experiencing problems, Sandra immediately shifted our legal strategy to focus on the practice's failure to maintain accurate medical records and Dr. Bennett's negligent reliance on corrupted data. She filed additional complaints with state medical authorities and began building a class action case representing all patients affected by the database errors. The case attracted attention from healthcare privacy advocates and local news outlets interested in electronic medical record security. The media coverage created unexpected complications for my employment situation. While my coworkers now understood that my psychiatric diagnosis had been wrong, the news stories inevitably mentioned my name in connection with mental health issues and workplace safety concerns. Some colleagues seemed suspicious about whether the error was really accidental, while others acted uncomfortable around me, as if mental illness might be contagious. Janet tried to be supportive when I returned to work in January, but the dynamics in the office had fundamentally changed. Projects I'd worked on for years were reassigned to other people, and I wasn't included in meetings I'd previously attended regularly. My performance reviews became focused on stress management and emotional regulation, despite my work quality remaining consistently high. The legal proceedings dragged on for another 18 months, with depositions, expert witnesses, and extensive document review. Sandra's investigation revealed that the software company had known about database corruption issues, but had concealed them from medical practices to avoid liability. Dr. Bennett's practice had ignored multiple warning signs and failed to implement basic data verification procedures recommended by healthcare regulators. We eventually settled out of court for an amount I'm not allowed to discuss, but the financial compensation couldn't restore my professional reputation or undo the career damage. My employment records still contained references to psychiatric leave and accommodation requirements that made changing jobs nearly impossible. Insurance companies had permanent documentation of my supposed mental health history, affecting coverage decisions for years afterward. Dr. Bennett's practice was ultimately shut down by state medical authorities after investigators found widespread record-keeping violations and patient safety issues. He lost his license temporarily and had to complete extensive retraining before resuming practice under supervision. The electronic medical record company faced millions of dollars in fines and was required to implement new data security measures industry-wide. The other patients in our class action lawsuit had varying experiences with recovery and compensation. The elderly man who'd been given inappropriate psychiatric medication developed permanent side effects and ongoing health problems. The woman whose bipolar disorder went untreated experienced a severe manic episode that resulted in hospitalization and job loss. Several patients never fully trusted medical professionals again, avoiding necessary health care out of fear of similar errors. 2 years after Dr. Bennett's original apology voicemail, I finally felt ready to write a detailed account of the experience for a healthcare policy journal. The article was published with extensive fact-checking and legal review, contributing to new regulations requiring independent verification of electronic medical record transfers. Healthcare advocates used my case as evidence for stronger patient rights legislation and improved oversight of medical technology companies. The lasting impact of the apology that made everything worse extends beyond the immediate financial and professional consequences. I developed persistent anxiety about medical appointments and employment situations, always worried that some administrative error might upend my life again. Simple interactions with doctors or HR representatives trigger memories of sitting in that conference room, staring at medical notes that described someone I'd never been. My relationship with my brother David eventually recovered, but the initial doubt he'd expressed about my mental state created lasting tension between us. He apologized repeatedly for not believing me immediately, but the damage to our trust couldn't be entirely repaired. Other family members and friends admitted later that they'd also wondered if I might have been experiencing psychiatric symptoms without realizing it. The experience taught me that institutional apologies often serve the interests of the institution rather than the injured party. Dr. Bennett's voicemails were carefully worded to minimize his legal liability while appearing sympathetic and concerned. His correction letter was drafted by attorneys to provide some relief without admitting full responsibility or making the practice vulnerable to other claimants. I still take anxiety medication, though from a different psychiatrist who specializes in treating patients traumatized by medical errors. The new doctor has spent considerable time reviewing my actual treatment history and helping me separate legitimate mental health concerns from the fabricated symptoms in the corrupted medical records. We've worked together to document my real psychological baseline for future reference. The irony of the situation remains that Dr. Bennett's apology, meant to begin fixing his catastrophic error, actually made everything exponentially worse by revealing the scope of the negligence and attracting legal and media attention. A quiet correction might have restored my job and reputation with minimal lasting damage. Instead, his remorseful voicemail messages created a public record of institutional failure that that extended the consequences for years. Looking back, I realized that the moment I heard genuine panic in Dr. Bennett's voice, I should have understood that this wasn't a simple mix-up that could be resolved with good intentions and corrected paperwork. His fear had been proportional to the actual magnitude of the problem, but I'd been too focused on getting my job back to recognize the warning signs that much worse revelations were coming. The unemployment office paperwork I'd filled out that first morning still sits in my file cabinet, a reminder of how quickly professional competence can be destroyed by someone else's mistake. Miss Morales had been right that I needed to take up the medical error with my doctor, but neither of us could have predicted that doing so would reveal a systematic breakdown in patient care that had been endangering people for months.